The Drum Candy podcast is brought to you by Drum Factory Direct.
What's up, everyone? Welcome into episode 56 of the Drum Candy podcast. This is your host, Mike Dawson, coming to you from Drum Factory Direct in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This week's guest is the great Joe Tomino. Joe Tomino is probably best known as the co-founder and drummer for Dub Trio. Dub Trio has many albums out. The discography is pretty vast, so definitely check all their records out. They were also the backing band for Mike Patton's Peeping Tom, and they spent quite a few years as the backing band for the pop reggae artist Matisyahu. Joe was just through Pittsburgh here a couple weeks back with his improv band, Birth, which he's had for many years, and they were on a tour, a couple-week tour here. They stopped here at Con Alma in Pittsburgh. I got to check it out. It was absolutely amazing. Beautiful compositions, incredible playing, very creative, very adventurous, but also always attuned to be tasteful and respectful of the music. So we definitely start a conversation with that, and then we get into our usual gear talk and wherever the conversation goes. This is a really fun one. I hope you enjoy. Let's check it out. Joe Tomino. So after seeing you play, was that last week? Yeah, I guess it was a week ago today, with Birth, and then we talked briefly about the idea of practicing improvisation. So before I hopped on with you, I had to go play literally 3 minutes of solo drums. And it reminded me, a couple questions, but it also reminded me how cathartic it is to just sit down and just tap the instrument and make sounds and not worry about what comes out. So thank you for reminding me to do that. But then as I was playing, I started critiquing myself. So I'm going to come right out of the gates. How do you approach improv so that you don't critique yourself too much, or when is critique important in that process?
Well, it's interesting because for me, when I sit down on the drums and if I just improvise and just play, whether it's before a practice session or just with other people, obviously, you try to be as much in the moment as possible and not in the head and being just sort of objective playing. But it also helps for me, when I record my practice sessions, I try to save the critiquing, or the listening back to see what came out. Because, I try to be in it as much as possible in the moment and not think about the next thing that's going to come. Just let the brain go to the hands and the hands go to the drums and then that leads to one thing. It's very linear, whatever the idea is, the concept is. But I think I try to save the critiquing for if it's been recorded, whether it's with somebody else or solo. And I don't always record my practice sessions, so I think it's just a habitual thing. You get into the point of you do something every day and you fall into a way of doing it. So for me, it's when I do sit down and improvise, whether it's before a practice session or if I just have 5 minutes to play and I haven't played all day, I can just go down in the basement at any time and just play. I just let it come out, and maybe there's inspiration, or I saw or heard something, or I'm just drawn to it, whether it's a groove or something free form. And I just, obviously monkey mind, the mind starts to go all over the place. You start to think about maybe get inspired, or maybe you're like, well, this isn't grooving, or well, this is cool. How can I turn this into something? And that, that's cool too. But for me, I try to save the subjective part of it for when I finish the improv or when I finish playing. So it's going to always come in, you can't help it. But it's sort of like meditation, when you're sitting there in meditation, you are just observing, right? You're sort of an observer of your mind, of yourself. And the thoughts come in, and the idea is that, I liken it to clouds coming in or a train goes by. You're just observing these thoughts, or you're observing the clouds go by, and then you see what they are, and then they just pass, and then it keeps going, in a linear way,
Does that happen when you're performing too? Do you try to get into that meditative state?
Yeah, I try to, specifically if it's something where there's where it's improvisation. If I'm playing a tune that I played 100 times, or if I'm on a gig or tour where it's like sort of the same tune every night, yeah, it's cool to try to get into a meditative state, maybe with the groove or the feel of the pocket. But it's if it's going to be the same thing, whether it's the same worked out fill or you're playing the tracks, maybe a little bit harder to do that. But when I'm improvising, specifically like you were speaking about the birth show, when I'm doing those gigs, you know, a lot of times I see videos of myself playing and I have my eyes closed, you know, and as much as we're playing composed pieces, there's inherently a lot of improvisation in the piece. So, and a lot of it is, you know, audio cues, or like just because we played the tune so many times, we know sort of like a thing that's going to take us to the next part, or how to get to the next section, or how to end. So, you know, for me, when I close my eyes, that's sort of a sign that I'm definitely really in it. And I don't need to rely on any other stimulus, like approval from, you know, watching someone's hands, or like, here we go. Or like, if my eyes are closed, you could pretty much count on I'm pretty much in that state where I'm just letting anything come out that is appropriate for the music, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. How do you critique improvisation? Like, what are you listening for when you listen back?
Different. It depends on the style of improvisation. I mean, I guess for me, it's about, if I'm playing with other people, it's about, well, someone plays something or I play something and someone reacts. And it's like, well, how did that idea that we came up with together, how did that idea that I played off against their idea, how did that develop? Like, did I take it far enough? Was it working against what they said? Was I playing too much on top of what they said? Was I trying to do too much of what they were already doing? You know, was I, you know, these are all questions that I could ask myself. You know, I feel like if you do it enough, you listen back, you're like, well, yeah, that was pretty good. Or, well, we really tapped into something. You know, it could be a collective thing where, like, if you're listening back to, if you're doing, maybe if you're doing a recording session, even if you're playing like standards and, you know, you're following changes, or if it's completely free, you can sort of follow the arc and everyone sort of knows, like, we really hit it on that course, or that idea really peaked, you know, it's almost like a visceral thing. Like, you could really, more of a feeling and less of like a mind thing, less, you know, calculated or you know, empirical. It's maybe not as measurable with like data points, but more like intuition and feeling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now here's the big question for me. The vocabulary for improvising, where does it come from? Like, how do you know what to bring from your bag of tricks? You know, like what gets brought into the gig? Right.
Well, to me, that goes sort of group specific. Like, you know, when you start a group, when you start a band, if you're playing standards, you know, and like, you know, like say like the Keith Jarrett trios play the standards, right? They have a way to interpret. I mean, obviously you're going in from an individual, right? They all have their own way of approaching their instrument, but also they're, you know, it's coming from like tradition as well. So you build upon the language that comes before you, and then you have a way of interpreting that in your instrument. And then you have a way of staying within a framework or breaking the framework within that group, whether it's a trio or whatever the size of the group is. So if you break it down, to me, you break it down to like the individual, you build up a language, you know. And for me, like, I'm coming from a lot of different things, you know. My roots are, you know, so many different elements, you know, rock and reggae and hip hop and avant-garde jazz and classical. So those are all, these are all my influences. And then when, I guess I could just, again, take it to birth, because we were speaking about that. When we started, you know, that group was very specifically into sort of avant New York jazz circa like late 90s, early 2000s. And also like that whole, when electronic music was breaking in the late 90s, specifically like avant, sort of more experimental, like electronic music, like someone like, I don't know, Richard D. James or Square Pusher, Amon Tobin. That was all sort of new, in like the late 90s. So that language of birth started from being inspired by those sort of sounds. So we had our individual language. Josh, the saxophonist, is definitely coming from more of a traditional swinging inside jazz, straight ahead. I mean, he's in a lot of different things, but that was sort of his background, and then, I kind of maybe brought more of the electronic thing. So we had this sort of like common language that we were listening to. And so within that, when we started improvising, because that band just started improvising, we didn't write any tunes. It was just like, let's go in the basement and just play and see what comes up. And it started as a duo before we got a bass player. So we built up a language, a concept of what the band was going to be, what could work. And so within that, being able to draw upon those influences that we were listening to at the time, and bring our individual and collective influences into the improv, that was what the language was. And so within that, I feel like, to me, the beauty is like when you could play anything that you've been influenced by from your entire career as a musician, from when you came up to where you are right now. If you could play that, and it could just be coming from a place of like honesty and serving like the moment, and not being like, check out me, I could do this style, or I could do this lick, this thing. When you could just be really honest about just playing whatever you want at any time, man, that's a real true blessing. Like, not only is it a blessing to you as an individual and to the listener, but also to the music that you're playing with that group. Not every group calls for that. Obviously, when you're playing funk tunes, even if you're improvising on a solo, it's like you're probably not going to throw too much, I don't know, Max Roach or Sonny Murray or I don't know what, you know what I mean? So, you sometimes you have to stay in a framework, but taking it to the birth thing, that band built up a language, and there's so much freedom intrinsic in the language and in the composition that I really do feel like I could kind of play anything. I could play reggae, I could play a one drop, or I could play, a drum and bass groove, or I could play completely like, wall of sound, lots of notes and texturally, whatever. So it's sort of like a understanding, even if you don't talk about it, because we never really talked about it too much. It just kind of happened naturally. Like, it's about the language. Different groups have different language and different approaches. And within that, you try to stay, you don't have to, but I try to like respect the music to stay within that dialect, that language that the music or the band that's built up.
Was there any discussion of like the dynamic of the band? Because I was really surprised how controlled the dynamics were. Was it from the very, very beginning, we're going to go acoustic, like minimal amplification? Was that discussed?
Oh yeah. First I thought you were talking about like dynamic, like who's taking the lead.
No.
Yeah. So volume, like dynamics. Yeah. It's interesting. I don't remember that being a thing. I mean, when we were pretty young. Josh was probably like 18 and I may have been 20, or maybe Josh was 17 and I was 19. So when you're that young, yes, there were dynamics and we played, soft and loud everywhere in between. But I think as the compositions came to fruition and as they developed over the years, the dynamics sort of unless they were really spoken, talked about, like, and dictated, I think they kind of came out as we played the songs over and over and over. Like, it had just more of like a natural progression. You know, it wasn't always like, all right, guys, this is definitely going to be the quiet part, and then we're going to take it up, and we're going to crescendo, and we're going to go really loud here. It's just like, it's sort of like when you look at a classical piece, you know, someone's up there conducting it, they're leading like the way that they interpret the score. Even though the score might have dynamics, you can follow a score of different conductors, and it's not always on the money of like how the arc of the dynamics go, or even like the tempo, you know, of where the time is. So I feel like specifically that band, that's just something that happens naturally. And usually that's another thing, you know, to talk about is like, it's all about listening. You know what I mean? If someone is like, and obviously as drummers, we're really in charge. You know, it's not I'm always in charge, but you know, if the drummers obviously starts playing quietly, the other players can make a conscious decision to play loud and like have this juxtaposition, or they'll be like relate and they're going to bring it down. So, but I think it's a big part of that band is listening. You know, it's like if someone brings it down or if someone clicks on a distortion pedal, you know, chances are you're going to react and play more intensely or more aggressively, you know, or if they click off the distortion pedal, if I automatically switch to, or if I start improvisation with brushes, you know, unless you're really making a conscious choice to the other players to like really go against it and play something really sort of aggressive, the timbre sort of dictates, and even the music. If it's maybe a pretty section, maybe you're not going to usually approach it. If it's really melodic and beautiful, you know, I'm not going to be probably bashing. So the music dictates, the listening dictates, the timbres dictate, whether it's a pedal or for a drummer, you know, what you're using your hands or a stick or a brush or a mallet. So there's a lot of elements to that. With that band, there are some notes where like, okay, we're gonna hit these. This measure is gonna be loud, then we're gonna bring it back down. But very little of that. I think it's a lot about listening and developing it over time. The music dictates, really.
Mm-hmm. So how have those arrangements solidified? Like, is it? I'm thinking like, as you made some palette decisions for each song. Like this one, I'm going to have some metallic instruments, or I'm going to use brushes. Like, does it change each time you perform, or how quickly do you find your palette for each piece?
Yeah. It's a good question. I try to have as much on board. I feel like it might with that band. Every band's sort of different, but like with Staying on Birth, with that band, I'll always have some sort of like auxiliary percussion, some sounds like whatever it is, something usually metallic and maybe something wood, and then I'll obviously have a bunch of different choices as far as sticks and mallets and brushes and all that. So there's all these choices I can make. And, you know, I play electronics in that band too. So I'll have some sort of electronic setup. And sometimes that changes before a tour. Like if we go out, I'm just going to like go down and grab these things. I'm going to grab this pedal or that pedal. The stick bag is usually what it is. It's got a lot of stuff in there. So that doesn't always change too much unless I acquire or accrue something and I want to try it out on tour or a gig. But those other things on the peripheral might change tour to tour, gig to gig, and so you fall into like this tune might start. I've been starting with this, and this sort of is really working. So I'll explore that every night. I'll start with similar thing, a similar concept. And again, that's maybe more tour to tour, like if you're developing something over multiple dates on the road. But it's not always the same, like tour to tour. Like, I might bring out different instruments and like I might start a piece one day with electronics or one tour with electronics, but the next time maybe it's just brushes, or so. And then also that was a thing that Birth started doing since we got back together a few years ago, because there was like a 12-year hiatus where we didn't play at all. But as we started improvising on gigs, and that's something we never really did, like complete improv, like no tunes. That's something we never really did on the bandstand. That's always like was more reserved for the beginning of the band, the genesis of like how we started playing together. So we started improvising on gigs, like maybe 2 or 3 improvisations in a night. And then that's like anything goes. That's like Jeremy might hit a long tone, and then I'll be inspired to like grab something, or I'll just grab a couple of things and set them on the drums, and I'll either start or wait till someone starts and be like, okay, this is going to work, or I'll listen and that's not going to work and I'll grab something else. So again, staying in the moment, trying to listen to what the moment or what the music or what the other people are doing, how that affects my choice, So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. How is the music presented to you? Is it a lead sheet? Is it a score? How do you get it?
Yeah, we all kind of write out sometimes it's lead sheets. Josh tends to write in lead sheets. Jeremy's he works a lot as a composer. He's classically trained and conducts orchestra. So his are more score-like. Mine are definitely like they're written out, my pieces. So like I'll write out one person's parts and then like ABC, and then the next person's ABC. So it's less of like a linear thing, like lists like sax and drums. And I don't think anyone's ever really written out a drum part. Maybe they'll have like an idea for a beat or a concept, but a lot of times I feel like I'm just reading lead sheets, and when I present my pieces to them, they're more of like, here's this section, here's this melody, and then we sort of like either play it as is. And a lot of times people come with compositions and we develop them as a band. It's not like this is the way it is and this is the way I want you to do it and that's how it's going to be. Like, I feel like when you put those sort of limitations on a band, because it's not like one dude hires other improvisers to play their music, because that's a thing too, and that's cool. But when you start putting those limitations and start telling people what to play, it's not really. I feel like it's not really a band, a collective anymore. That's how I feel when I play in certain ways. I mean, I'm cool to play something, the way someone wants it to be played. But I think there's beauty in like letting people play the way they want to play and the way they hear something. And if it doesn't work, maybe you could suggest something else. Just say, no, that's really the way I want to do it. Again, then it develops, new pieces develop on the road, or having played them on and on and on. They take, even still, pieces that we were playing together in the early 2000s, even the late 90s, some of the early pieces sort of are different every time. There's, they still different approaches, and that's what keeps things fresh, to me. I mean, yeah.
So this recent run was a couple weeks, right?
Yeah, almost 2 weeks. Yeah.
So how did things evolve during that course of the first show versus their last show?
Well, the first show, everyone sort of flew in the night before, and we didn't have time to rehearse because I had a gig and someone else was doing something. So basically, the first show was in Cleveland, and it was on the bandstand. So we hadn't played in like, months. And, it's a language, and it's like, it's also like reading, trying to remember some of the form, some of the tunes. So it was almost like a paid rehearsal. But we've been playing together so long that there's a trust and there's a language and there's a, it's never really going to fall flat with that band. I feel like no one's going to fall flat. If someone does something and there's a mistake, quote unquote mistake, it's going to work itself out within, a measure or within a section. So it was kind of like a refamiliarization of like, all right, this is the vibe. This is where we're at. This is where we're at individually. This is where we're at in the moment. And then, within that tune, because that was like maybe like an hour-long set. And it sort of solidified, like we had talked about the night before, the day before, like what pieces we want to do on the tour. Like we should maybe kind of listen to them or like pull them out of all of our charts that we have, kind of come in somewhat rehearsed. We may have actually talked about it like on a group chat and said like, okay, we're going to do this piece, that piece, and maybe got it in order together. So we kind of had a core group of tunes, but one of the nights we did, it was like 3 sets. So it was like we had to pull a bunch of tunes. So maybe we were listening to tunes that we didn't do on some of the earlier dates in the van on the drives. Oh yeah. So remember that tune? That happens like 6 times, and then there's the break, and then we, kind of relearning the composition and the arrangement. But also, so there was a core set of tunes, but within that, again, the beautiful thing is like night to night, the improv that's in the tune, the sections, whether we improvise out of like an A section over a set number of bars, or if it's chord changes or a bass line and a drum beat, that changes night to night. Maybe how long it goes on, or the arc of the solo, or the dynamic of the section, or sometimes even the way we get into the next section. Sometimes it could be like it could disintegrate, and then I'll set up the time by hitting 2 chord notes, and it's like that's the chord note, 1, 2, boom, that's the downbeat. Or maybe it's a cue. Maybe Josh plays a pickup, like a horn line that kind of sets the tempo. If it's sort of like a big shift in tempo change, or if it's a dynamic thing, we're all playing really loud, and I'll just end the tune with a shift about, like everyone's listening, So listening really dictates how the composition changes night to night. But for this tour, it was definitely a set of like maybe 6, 7 tunes with maybe 3 or 4, 2 or 3 improvs within that. And then if we had to bring some, other tunes that we hadn't played, we would listen on the way to the gig to get them up to where we kind of remembered the form. And then they're just there, once we play them once, even if they don't go perfectly, they're going to work out, So they develop night to night, really upon just, again, going back to listening. I feel that's such an important part, that whether you're improvising, like going back to what we were talking about in the beginning, whether you're listening as an individual to yourself, playing in the moment, and just choosing how to react linearly without subjectivity, without judging, just being like, yeah, I'm really like doing this thing now, maybe I just go right here, without trying to be making too many choices, just letting the brain just like tell you where to go with the heart, tell you where to go in the next moment. Or as a group, playing this piece, we've been doing this piece, and this is sort of how it's been going, but this is how I feel today, and this is where I'm going to put it. Let's see if they react. If not, it's cool. I'll go where they go, or maybe we'll be at ends. Maybe this meeting of someone doing something different this night's going to take it to a different space, different place, which keeps it fresh. You know what I mean?
Have you guys ever had a bad gig, like a bad set?
There's always things that make things challenging, like something's not working in the monitor, but I feel like there's some things out of your control. Maybe someone's having a bad day emotionally or physically, and that might affect the music. You can tell something's not totally where it has been or right. But these things usually you can't control. It's just more of like approaching the music of like knowing that this is the situation that you're in. Like the last gig we did, there was sort of like some sound issues, and we started like sort of a half an hour later than we were supposed to, that we should have. And, there was an issue that really couldn't get worked out. And, it's just me speaking. I was like in my head a little bit about like, well, this isn't right. I know there's something happening here, and I could choose to be bummed out about it and let it affect the music, or I could just be like, well, I've had plenty of gigs where stuff doesn't go the way it is, whether it's the drums aren't doing, you're on back line, or the monitor mixes them right, or someone's in a bad mood, and you just kind of let it be what it's going to be, and hopefully it works out. So it's a long-winded way to answer your question. I mean, there's gigs that are better than others because we get to collectively to a certain point that we've gotten to in the past, that where the music can get to. But every gig is going to be different. So I try not, just speaking myself, I try not to be too judgmental of like, well, that gig wasn't really that good, because I know we did a better one the night before, last week, or a year ago, or that recording, that live thing. So maybe we don't always get to the same place, and you always want to strive to be to the best place that you can musically, but you just sort of take it for what it is. I do. Like when you're improvising or when you're recording, even if it's improvised or not improvised music, you're capturing the moment. And so every picture is just that moment. Every gig is just that moment, and it's going to be different no matter what, whether it's, again, improvising, playing the tracks, or practicing. Excuse me. So just try to be honest with yourself and let it be what it's going to be. I mean, some gigs are better than others. Some are.
What is your approach to composing music for this project or for other projects?
Well, yeah. I write primarily on keyboard or piano, and or bass. I mean, I'm not really going to be doing many gigs on either of those instruments, but I know my way around both, where I know harmony and chords and fingerings and things, where I can figure things out and write on those two instruments. So when I approach, because a lot of bands that I play in that were my own bands that I would compose for, or if I'm doing a production thing where I'm writing a song for someone or for something, I could primarily compose on those two instruments. So I'm basically either thinking of the language or the concept that I'm going for, or that the music has been built upon, whether it's a band or a groove or a concept. Because if I'm writing like an idea for like my group Dub Trio, it might be a little different than the way I'm thinking of composing than I would really for Birth or a different band. So I might come up with like a melodic line on a piano, and I'll just write out that line, and then I'll maybe think of like either chords, like some sort of chordal structure that might work underneath that melody. Like, what is the shape of that melody? What chords could I put underneath it that work alongside the melody? Or maybe I'll go the other way and start with a bass line, figure out, a groove, a meter, a tempo. Maybe you can go like think about, well, this could be the drum beat. This sort of works alongside this bass line, or it kind of like works within and inside that bass line. Maybe program that, and then kind of get out the keyboard and start thinking about a melodic line or even a phrase like a loop. You could even be loop based and like, program that and then think about something that could work on top of that loop. So building in terms of either, it's usually for me, it's either building in terms of a loop, getting something down, and then building on top of the loop, sort of like a hierarchy of like building layers, or a linear thing of like, okay, this is a 4-bar phrase or an 8-bar phrase, and the melody is this long, and then maybe coming up with chords or bass notes that sort of go along with a chord or with the melody to work with that structure, the melodic structure of the line. Mm-hmm. It doesn't usually start with drums. I mean, sometimes I have a friend of mine that I write with sort of like a production duo. It's called Other Animal, my friend Jake Fader. And, we're doing a lot of like composing. A lot of times it does start with the drums. Like we'll go in with like, we're going to do like this sort of like 60s psych thing, or we're going to do this reggae thing, like really like sort of specific, like, Studio One, early, 60s, late 50s thing, or we're going to do something like really like kind of 80s. I'll go in like an approach tuning the kit or getting sounds, like sometimes we go to tape or putting stuff on the drums or choosing how many mics to use, where to place the mics. So that in those instances, it does start with the drums and the way they're mic'd or the way they're recorded or the way I'm approaching them from a standpoint of playing the drums, tuning, physicality of like intention of how hard I'm hitting, how quiet I'm hitting for the way the mics are reacting. So it's different with every group, I would say, definitely in a production standpoint, it starts, I guess, more with the drums if I'm thinking about it. And then, but if I'm composing for a group, it's more sort of in the box or like with a bass line, and I'll write stuff out on a piece of paper and send it to somebody or just remember it and show somebody a line in rehearsal or in a writing session.
How do you know when a piece is done?
When it gets recorded. Well, even then it's not done, to be completely honest with you. Because even like, say like something like Dub Trio, like, even that band has a lot of improvisation built into it. Or Birth and any other number of things. So, if we record something and it's captured, people might know the groove. That's not really going to change. The form might not change too much. The sections might not change too much. The hits won't change. But there is sort of still that like arc of like what happens in the piece, Even like something as simple as like, even if it's like a guitar solo in a song, the solo is usually, some solos might not change night to night. And like people come to know guitar solos. Like if I go see or hear Pink Floyd, I want to be able to sing those beautiful David Gilmour melodies. He's probably not going to change those solos too much. And you rely on those. So maybe those kind of pieces don't change too much, but when a piece is done, I guess I don't really want it to be done. I want to play tunes that sort of have these little things that change night to night. Like it's cool to play the tracks and to play behind a vocalist and rely on, the front of house engineer to make everything balance and can count on everything working out and being great. And that's beautiful too. And I love doing that, but doing that for like 1 or 2 months could get maybe, I wouldn't say boring, but there might not be the spark that like inspires you night after night. So those pieces might be done, is my point. Mm-hmm. When they're recorded and it's a pop tune, the beauty is that they work because there's all these great elements that are tracked and recorded and mixed and they sound a certain way. And there's a shape and there's a melody and there's a form. and that's when they're done. It's like they're perfect, or they're what they are, and they work great because that's the way they are, and that's when they're done. Some tunes aren't done because they develop night after night. Yes, the structure is done, the bones are done, but it's not really done because it's approached from a different emotional standpoint night after night, or even sonic standpoint. Like, every room is different, every audience is different. You play differently when people are like 2 feet from the stage versus you're playing a festival and there might be literally 30 feet between you and a barrier and then people, So it's always gonna be different, a different way to approach the piece. If there is a way to like navigate the song, if it can be different night to night, that's always going to affect the way that something is interpreted. So again, I'm not sure if it's ever really done unless it's like set in stone and you're playing the tracks and it's mixed a certain way, and people's parts never change. So yeah.
What's the status of Dub Trio?
The status of the Dub Trio is the last full length we did, I think it was released in 2019, and we toured that whole year. We did a couple like US runs. We did a headline run. We were out with Incubus, and then we did, we went to Japan and we did Europe, and then we literally played the last 2 shows we played we did New Year's and DC with Gogo Bordello opening for those cats. And then COVID hit. And so obviously we didn't do any more touring. And then over COVID, we did a single, maybe 2021, remotely. Everyone tracked remotely and we mixed it remotely. And we had a good friend, Benji Dredd, who sings in the band Skindred. He actually sang vocals on it. It was a cover of a Heini Kamosi tune. So we released a song about a year ago, remotely, a single, which we've never really done before. But because everyone lives in different places, we all lived in New York when we first started up. Like Dave, the guitar player, is in Charlotte, and Stu's in LA, and I'm in Cleveland. It's really hard and financially difficult to meet in a place, to rent all the gear, because it's not like we can just get together in someone's basement. There's a lot of gear that is required to make the music sound the way it sounds. Not to mention time to get together. And, I feel like everyone's in a place where we're sort of, doing what we've been doing individually over the past 2 years through the pandemic, which is, sort of not Dub Trio. So I guess the status of it is we have a plan to write and focus on it starting in 2023 for another album, which would be, I think, the 8th album that we've done. Yeah. 6th, 7th, or 8th album. So nothing's happening and no touring's happening. It hasn't since the pandemic. Other than that single, there'll probably be a 2-year gap, and then hopefully start writing in 2023 to record maybe sometime that year, hopefully. And then that, because, these days you got to like have an album or something to tour behind. So, we could just try to like go out there and play like a Europe tour, because I feel like we spent so much time as a band touring Europe that our fan base is a little bigger and more developed there than it is in the US, even though we put a lot of time in the beginning, opening up for a lot of great bands. I still feel like we developed more as a band from a tour standpoint in Europe than we did in the US. So we could probably do a Europe run and maybe make some dough or just, get some momentum. But I feel like we won't really probably do anything until we get another album under our belts, and probably next year. So that's
does that group write any differently? Do you write collectively, or is it everyone brings their own compositions?
We've been writing collectively the last couple records. People might come in with ideas, riffs, but they're always developed as a group. Mm-hmm. And that group, even from the beginning, what's interesting about that group is we really try to compose and produce the pieces very much in the vein of the way traditional dub was recorded. Like, we might have a song, like a layout of an arrangement, ABC or ABC or whatever it is. So when we do go in to record, we might lay down all the tracks, like literally play start to finish, and then really the arrangement or the production informs the way the composition is. So like everything's recorded, whether it's to tape or in the box, and then we do the arrangement post-production like an engineer or a dub producer would do, in the way that they're adding effects to tracks, they're muting tracks, they're playing the faders, dropping things in and out, like really approaching it on like the composition on the mixing board or even in the box, whether you're taking out or muting things in there or drawing in automation for effects. We really try to approach that band compositionally from a standpoint of being true to what dub was from the genesis of that music. Like, really, which is what it was, it was really the birth of the remix. These guys were taking pop tunes, Jamaican pop tunes, which were really pop tunes from like early R&B and jazz, US tunes. So they were recording those in Jamaica, and then a producer would take the 4-track or 2-track or 8-track, put it on a reel-to-reel, put it on a mixing board, and they would usually mute a vocal or not have the vocal be prominent, but focusing on the drum and the bass or the arrangement of the instruments, and then just bringing those things in and playing the mute button or the faders in the mixing board or the aux or the EQ. And so approaching it in terms of playing the mixing board to inform the composition from what the actual tracks were, what the bass tracks were. So we've tried to keep that as much as possible. Not every tune is that way, but a lot of records really go that way when we mix and produce. We start with the bass tracks and then really compose on the mixing board or post. That informs the composition, if you will. But we do write individually and bring something together to a group and then develop it collectively, whether it's in like a rehearsal studio for a week before we go into a session, which is sort of the way it's been the past 2 records, because we've all lived in different cities over the past 2 records. So we've come together in LA for the last record for a week, or in New York in a rehearsal room for a week, and developed our compositions and then gone to the studio and recorded it. So, but in the early days, it was like we were all in the same city. We were all in Brooklyn or New York, so we would develop them together in practice rooms over maybe a couple months. But, the means of just being in different cities have justified it, at different ends, sort of like we'd have to kind of get it done in a week, run a rehearsal studio and work it all out, then go right to record. But once they're recorded and mixed a certain way, again, those tunes are different night to night. There's different cues that cue certain sections. And things might go on a little longer. Arcs might be different. So there is a different way of interpreting these tunes night to night, which keeps it fresh, for a listener, someone who's seen the band 10 times, or as us who played the songs 100 times,
How do you handle the dubbing aspect live?
The dubbing aspect live is done all on stage as a group. So even when we started, if you go see a band, a reggae band, even from back when, even to date, 95% of bands are any dubbing, any effect sounds and stuff that's being done to manipulate the instruments are usually done by the front of house engineer. They're throwing the effects or doing those things from front of house. To me, that never really made sense. I mean, it makes sense and it's cool, but like as a dub band, it never made sense to me because as a band on stage, it's really hard to react to what the front of house engineer is doing. If he throws a delay on, and usually you're not getting the delay sends that are going through the front of house that the audience is hearing, you're not usually hearing that on your monitor mix, whether it's in-ears or in your monitor. So how can you react musically as a dub group to what someone else is doing compositional? So having said that, we all have sort of a bunch of effects and microphones on the drums or the bass and the guitar, because it's a guitar, bass, drums ensemble trio. We all have a bunch of pedals because there's no tracks in that band. I mean, I do play sampler, and there might be like some samples that we play, whether it's like a not really a loop, but maybe like a vocal line or like some we can't really cover, like a 1-bar thing that we can't do. So other than that, it's usually mics on drums or guitar or bass through pedals that we manipulate in real time. So in other words, say I'm playing a groove, I have like a pedal board on my left. I can throw on a spring reverb on the drums, play to it again. So obviously the bass player, Stu Brooks, and the guitar player, Dave Holmes, they have the drum effects in their monitor mix, so they can react to what I do. So if I hit a spring reverb, Dave might say, "Oh, Joe just hit the spring reverb. He doesn't always do it. It's not always in the same place." So then, or Stu, I hear he's doing that, I'm going to drop out. It's like as if the monitor, as if like the engineer and the studio producer, whether it's someone like the Roots guys like Scientist or King Tubby, they hit the mute on the bass and threw up the spring reverb on the drums. We do that by listening on stage. Or if I do a big drum fill and hit a crash with an effect on it, and I catch the cymbal and catch the tail of the delay, that might cue maybe a rhythm thing. So I'll drop out, let the tail of the cymbal go. Dave knows he's just going to chuck over that because it's like that might be what would happen if we were mixing it. So a lot of it is listening on stage, and we do all the effect and all the sounds that you hear on stage. That being said, the way it's presented from a mix standpoint, and I'm talking in terms of the way things feel, because with Dub Trio, it's not all roots 70s style dub. It's literally, that band has become sort of like a metal dub band, almost like metal, like in terms of like Meshuggah metal. And so like kind of like riff based, odd meter, but also if you were to juxtapose that with like King Tubby and Scientist, so it's this really interesting blend of the two. So at one point, maybe say the A section of a tune is this really heavy, super distorted guitars, really driven bass, almost like you want the click, 7K, whatever, like quarters on the bass drum, wooden beaters. You want that sort of thing going on the mix, and then boom, all of a sudden it drops out to a thing, and then you're into this spacey, really deep dub thing. So maybe hopefully the mix engineer, if we take someone on tour, they know the tune. So maybe they do the thing where they all of a sudden go to the outside kick, or they may have a setting where they hit a button and it changes the EQ curve of the kick drum, or the bass player Stu, he might click off the distortion and all of a sudden it goes to a different channel. It's really sort of rootsy, subby. Dave clicks off the distortion, and all of a sudden he's into this layer thing where he's building like layers of like spacey Ebo guitar. So there's all these timbre moves that change, in the way that it's mixed. So the mix engineer is important in terms of sonically the way it sounds and feels, but they're not making any dub moves. That's all done in real time on stage as a trio. So because we know, again, it's a language. We built up this language within the piece as a band. We know how to react if someone does something, and it's all done on stage as a group in real time,
So are you running your own set of mics to go into your pedal board, or is it some sort of a set?
Yeah, it's all mics. For me, my setup is really pretty basic. Like, even like if I'm playing, like because Dub Trio was the backing artist for Matisyahu for many years. And, Matisyahu has like sort of like, as much as it's like pop music, there's a lot of improv in that. But we were still doing the Dub Trio aesthetic and approach with that music. So even with Birth or an improvised gig, my setup is really pretty basic. I have a mixer and maybe like sort of like a little phrase sampler or an SPDSX. And then all that's going into the mixer. And then I'll have effects where I'm running a loop of a send of a different effects, usually guitar pedals. And so I can choose to affect either microphone lines in the mixer, or I could choose to affect, say I just plug like a phone, I'm doing an improvising. I have a phone going into the mixer. I can affect the phone if I'm playing sounds on the phone, or if I loop something on the phone, I can use that effect send as an aux send and take my pedals and affect the phone. Or if I have the SPXX going in the mixer, I can affect or not use that effect send to affect the mixer. So it's mics on the drums going into the mixer with effect send of usually a chain of guitar pedals that I can add effects to. Also, there's EQ. I can EQ these things to do something different. If I want to take a microphone and I want to have some like distortion, but I want it to be like a really something, I'll take, for instance, this might be a little experimental, but I'll take the mic, I'll hit the floor tom, I'll put the mic right on the drum, I'll throw up the distortion or the gain on the line, and I'll crank the lows on the EQ to where I get this really 60, 80 hertz, this sub frequency, 40 hertz, but maybe there's gain on it. Maybe there's like some saturation or some color that might bring out overtones. Because what the beautiful thing is about drums and distortion is there's so many overtones on a drum that you could just play with overtones in the way you mess with EQ or the way you mess with like distortion. And it brings out all these beautiful overtones that a snare drum, that a tom has. So again, going back to it, it's mics on drums, mixed into a mixer, effects send with pedals, and then usually if I'm doing, depending on the gig, I'll have an SPSX triggering phrase samples or sounds, just like one shots. And I also have a little like phrase mixer, which basically I use the phrase sampler rather, which is I'll use for like, again, sounds or taking a loop in real time of the drums and kind of affecting the loop, or that's really it. It's not really that complex.
Does the effects ever get out of control?
Sometimes, but that you can play with that. Usually, like if they're getting out of control, it's because they're going through a wedge. So if I'm not playing a gig where I'm not on in-ears, that could be more pronounced than if I'm on in-ears. Usually, if nothing from the mic starts feeding back into a wedge, if I'm on in-ears, there usually isn't that problem. If I'm doing a tour where it's like a throw and go, or if it's a tour where there aren't in-ears, they can get out of control. But then you kind of learn, like for me, I know that 400 or 500 might tend to feedback because that's sort of the resonance of like the snare drum and where that sort of rings out. So I'll have the monitor engineer take a dip out, or I'll just hear like, yo, 5K is really ringing out in this room. Just notch that out. Or 200's really taking off, the low mids or whatever. So maybe we could just either take a small curve or really pull it out tight. They can get out of control, so you can choose to play with it and have fun with it. Or if it's not something you can work with, maybe to help, have the monitor engineer help you like keep it under control. A lot of times, if you're working with a monitor engineer and they're just, on the fly or like a house guy, especially with dub trios, speaking of like, front of house guy, if you don't have your own guy, they hear all this like sonic stuff coming from the stage. And sometimes, sometimes you want 5K to just ring out and like to be really aggressive and like kind of like shocking. Mm-hmm. And they'll just freak out because they don't know. And it's like, well, fuck, man. That's the idea. That's what you're going for. You're going for this like this shocking like thing. It's going to come out. But like, so yeah, it can get out of control and it can be intentional sometimes as a sensational effect, as an emotional thing. And sometimes not. And you got to kind of try to rein it in and work with like, whoever's doing sound, whether it's monitor or front of house. But it can get out of control. Less so with in-ears because there's not stuff ringing back, going into, not like sort of a feedback loop going on stage. But it can be fun to play with it. If it does, sometimes it's fun, sometimes not. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell me about the kit you were using with Birth on this run. It was a pretty unique setup.
Yeah, so that band, I had a small 16-inch kick, sort of tuned, wide open. There's a pillow in there that I can like shimmy, like kind of like either touching one head, batter head, or touching the front head, or not. I tend to like sort of read sort of the room. There was, a coated head on that, and then I think there was like a faux Evans, like the faux calfskin, that 56, whatever that head is on the non-batter head. So that's tuned pretty open and pretty low. And I'll try to sort of choose where, or if the pillow inside, just by sort of tilting the drum where it lives on the head. So that's sort of a 16-inch kit or kick. And the floor tom, that's like a Masters Pearl. That's a Masters custom, like 90s. Like that's coated. That's sort of also tuned pretty wide open, pretty low, sort of like in the same vein as the kick drum. Mm-hmm. Kind of like no real muffling. I mean, depending on the room, I might put a little tape or a moon gel just on the edge, but I really go for that line to be kind of like wide open and just ringing out and like powerful sort of thing. The snare drum, 14 by 5 1/4. That's also sort of like that sort of faux calfskin head. Also tuned wide open, on more of like a jazz approach. Beautiful thing is, again, there's all those overtones that are happening. Die-cast hoops on that drum. So you can really, if I want to crack a backbeat, it's really like open for that and can project. The snares tuned, pretty open, so there's a lot of good response. And then I have like a 10-inch tom with the, single ply coated head. That's a 10 by, I want to say 4. that's also a snare drum, but I can also choose to keep it a tom, sort of tuned pretty high. So I guess if you're singing like melodically, that 10's really like cranked up. So it could be a tom. There really isn't much resonance because it's a small drum and it's cranked up pretty high. So it's kind of firecrackery and short, but it's like that's the highest pitch. Then the snare drum without the snare tom might be the next lowest. Floor tom, pretty low, pretty open and thuddy, boomy. Not like thud rock, but there's definitely a tone to it, but like has resonance. And then the kick drum is pretty open and ringing. So they're really open singing drums in terms of like jazz, but not so bop tuning. It's not like cranked really high. It's not like a Tony kick drum where you're like really getting like a fundamental of like a high tuned kick drum, or that's fun to play too, but like that doesn't really work with. I mean, it could work, and I do have played that tuning like kind of like a backline kit with Birth. If you go to a jazz club and I'm going to play a backline kit. Like for instance, that gig you saw at Cone Alma, there was a backline kit that sounded great. It was perfect for jazz and for bop stuff. And I could have tuned it to be the way I wanted to sound, or just played it the way it is, and that could be kind of fun and inspiring. Like if you play a kit that's in a different tuning that you don't always play, it might inform decisions like in a different way of approach, and that's cool. But because I was near the end of the tour and like I've been playing my own kit, and I know John, the owner, he was like, "Man, if you want to play your own kit, we could just strike this kit." And it was like, no, I do want to play my own kit, and like if it's not a problem. So I played my own drums that night, but yeah, there's a lot to choose from there. There's a lot of choices, like a really low, boomy kick. And if I want to be sort of tight, I might bury the head in the beater. And if I want to ring, I just might not hit it, as hard, or just hit it and pull off of it. So I have a lot of like options in terms of like pitch. I could like choose the high to the low, but also they're really ringing out. So if I want that really open as much as you can get, like a Bonham thing with like a 16-inch kit, it's really pretty boomy and low and open. So I like the palette that it gives. Orchestrally, the high highs and low lows, and they're open, or I could approach them and get them tight, put a wall on a snare drum or a metal thing or whatever,
So we're getting close to the end of the hour here, but I wanted to ask about, how does all of this creative and open-ended playing inform or not inform when you just have to play songs?
Good point. Interesting. Well, let's see. When I just have to play songs, I want to serve the song and the purpose of the gig. Like when I moved back to Cleveland, and I was still doing quite a bit of touring. And then once the pandemic hit, like that last year, I started playing some wedding band gigs with the wedding band here in Cleveland. And, all great players. And it's like, I'd never done that my entire career. I mean, I played some GB gigs, like playing like straight ahead stuff, maybe a big band, maybe occasionally like covers, but playing like wedding band songs that are really pop tunes that I've heard, and people have heard a gazillion times, but never really like learned all of them. And they're all perfect. Going back to like when a song's done, they're pop tunes, and they sound great, and the mix is right, and the sound is right, and the approach is right, and the tempo's right, and the feel's right. So when it comes time to playing songs, I really try to give the attention to what the song is and requires, whether it's an original or a cover, So that might mean in terms of like the tempo, like a certain melody works at a certain tempo. A certain groove, a bass line, works within a certain, BPM. You can play things 4 or 5 BPMs here or there, but a certain melody is not going to sit a certain way 10 to 20 BPMs faster or slower. It works within a certain framework. So honor the tempo of the song. Honor the way that I approach it, the way I'm hitting the drums. I'm not going to play At Last by Etta James the way I'm going to play that funky music, White Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Or it doesn't have to be a cover. It could be, or it's the way I'm playing a cumbia tune, with bells and like hitting the side of the rims. I'm not going to play, a King Tubby song or a Stevie Wonder tune with the same sort of swing. Swing is a way I would approach it. They all have their own way of swinging, like if you're playing like a hip hop song, like a Dilla tune or, a Fugees tune or whatever, that every track has its own swing, the way the bass line is or the way the vocal is or the way whatever is. So you kind of like trying to honor the swing of the tune. And it can be straight, it can be like a straight Bob Seger tune, like just straight on Kenny Aronoff style playing versus whatever, a Mick Fleetwood or whoever. So honoring the tempo, honoring the swing, honoring the approach and the way that you hit the drums, like from a velocity standpoint, from a volume standpoint, or even from an attitude, the way you're convincing to the band and to the dance floor, to the audience, the feeling you want to convey. So I think that's the way I approach tunes, and the other way, again, if I'm thinking in terms of production when I'm playing a song, it's the treatment of, because that's more of on a live tip. When I'm playing a song, it's the treatment is because I love the studio and I love recording. It's more about the treatment of the way the drums are treated with how they're tuned, what's dampening them, the way I'm hitting, and then the miking choices or the way the mics what they run into, whether it's compression or EQ. So it's how I'm hitting the drums and how that reacts to the mics, the drums themselves, and then how they're treated or tuned. So it really goes down to what does the song call for? What is that is sort of informs the way that I approach a tune,
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of basic, but
it seems like it's all, from the beginning you were talking about timbre and dynamics, and it's all intertwined, right? Whether you're improvising or playing.
Yeah, dynamics tell a story. You want to tell stories. I feel like it's great to be loud and aggressive all the time, and that's a thing too. But not too many. You can't. It's just like talking. There's pauses and there's rises when you're talking to somebody. Someone says something, you say something back. There's an arc and a cadence to someone's voice. If you want to be aggressive and make a point, you kind of get a little louder, and that to me is what makes music interesting. So,
Well, last question that I ask almost every guest. What was your first snare drum?
Nice. My first snare drum was a Rogers Dynasonic.
Whoa.
That my
nice.
dad had. Yeah. He was a drummer and had, which I still have, I don't have the snare drum, sadly, but I do have his first kit that he gave me, which is a Cleveland Eras Rogers pink champagne 12, 13, 16, 20 kit. And it's a little bit in disarray, but I still do pull them out from time to time and play them.
Nice.
I need to get like some of the bearing edges fixed, but they're still playable. But that was my first snare drum. The snare that he had on that kit.
Wow. Was it a metal one or a wood shell?
It was a metal one.
What happened to it?
I don't know. I may have given it to somebody to like a punk rock days, just sharing drums, it just disappeared.
Yeah.
Yep, sadly.
Well, it's not a bad first drum to start with.
Not bad.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything coming up that we should let people know about? I know I want to suggest everyone check out the Birth Records, all the Dub Trio stuff, but what else should people take a look at?
I don't know. I mean, I have a bunch of different, original bands. Birth, Dub Trio. I have a band called Togishi, which is a completely improv group. Togishi, which is the guy who polishes the samurai sword. So Togishi is the band. There's another band I play in called Yellowstone Apocalypse, which is like a duo guitar. It's sort of like a doom metal thing. I have a really fun band. There's no real music to check out yet, but it's called Hello 3D. That's a local Cleveland group, bunch of great cats. Does like cumbia stuff, which is really fun. I'm getting into the cumbia stuff lately. Whatever. Bunch of different things. So check out those bands. Birth, we released an album somewhat recently. I mean, started a tour on it. Actually, not 2 years old or whatever. But check out Dub Trio again. Dub Trio is a fun band. There's a lot of albums with Dub Trio, so you start to like the last album, 2019. But I'm easy to find. I'm around, so I appreciate you having me on, Mike.
Oh yeah, my pleasure, man. Thank you.
Yeah, my friend.
All right, that's it for this week's episode. Once again, if you like the show, please head over to iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere that you get this podcast. Drop us a 5-star review, type some words in there, some comments, share the episode. We want to get this show into the ears of more drummers around the world, as many drummers around the world as possible. So that's all I ask. Just give us a review, 5-star rating. Much appreciated. See you next week.